Greetings, everybody. Rob Chassner here, continuing in our series on Introduction to the Books of the Bible. And this video is covering the introduction to the book of Ruth. And so it's interesting that there are only uh, two books in the Bible where we found the titles to be women's names. One would be Esther, who was a Jew, and the other would be Ruth, who was a Gentile. It's also interesting that in the genealogy of Jesus Christ, which you'll find in Matthew chapter 1 and Luke chapter 3, you find the names of four women, which was very unusual back in biblical times. And one of those four women names would be Ruth, the book that we're discussing now. Ruth is the eighth book in the Bible, and we know that the number eight in Jewish numerology has the meaning of new beginnings. Jesus gave eight Beatitudes. You find that in the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew 5, 6, and 7. Uh, the Beatitudes was a new focus or a new direction for living. Eight also was a number where the number of days when a newborn boy would be circumcised, cutting away the flesh to make a new direction or a spiritual direction for one's life or a focus for one's life. And then there's something new that we find in the book of Ruth. Now, initially, it does not appear to be a very deeply spiritual book. We don't find God speaking to his people. We don't find deep doctrinal issues being discussed in this Bible. It seems to be 85 verses of these historic events. Um, of a Gentile ending up in the promised land. And we need to realize that the book of Ruth is a book of symbolism, symbolism. The theme of Genesis is beginnings. The theme of Exodus is redemption. The theme of Leviticus is worship. The theme of Numbers is walking with the Lord. The theme of Deuteronomy is obedience. The theme of Joshua is taking possession of that which God has promised. The theme of Judges is failure. And then we come to this study of the book of Ruth, which is all about symbolism. And then after Ruth, you've got the book of Samuel. And the book of Samuel is a book of the establishing of the kingdom. And so there is a transition where God's people are moving from being ruled by judges to being ruled by the king and a kingdom. And so, in between failure and the establishing of a kingdom, we find this unique book of historical events, which speaks of Boaz, who was the Lord of the harvest, taking to himself a Gentile bride, where she then receives her inheritance among the people in the land. Now, what do we see in the history of the church? We have the Old Testament, which speaks of the failure of Israel. We have the Gospels, which also speaks of the failure of Israel. And then we have, at some point in a future time, the kingdom to be established. Now, in between failure and the establishing of the kingdom, we find the Lord of the harvest. And as we go through the book of Ruth, we see symbolism. How Ruth is a picture or a foreshadowing of the church. Gentiles come out of from being a lost people and being brought into a marriage relationship with the Lord of the harvest. A very unique book indeed. In fact, there's an interesting story, event that took place in the life of Benjamin Franklin. He was on one of his trips to France. He was sitting in a group of dignitaries and aristocrats, and they began chiding him, rebuking him, or being critical of him on the establishing of the American government because much of the patterns of establishing the American government was establishing it according to biblical principles, according to the precepts of the Bible. And they were being very critical and they were saying, oh, that's an old book, referring to the Bible, it's superstition. And at that point, Franklin excuses himself from the meeting. He goes back to his room and he begins to write the book of Ruth in longhand. He copies the book of Ruth, and the only thing that he changed the Hebrew names to French names. And then on his second meeting with these same dignitaries and aristocrats, he said, you know, before we get started, I'd like to read something for you. And so he begins to read to them the book of Ruth. And these aristocrats and these dignitaries are absolutely blown away. They're commenting that, oh, that was just awesome, that was magnificent. And they suggested to Franklin, you know, you should get this published. And Franklin, of course, replies, well, I cannot publish this because it's already published. And they said, well, what is it called? And he said, this is called the Bible. And so the book of Ruth is a book of symbolism in the midst of darkness for a nation of people. And we find a picture of God's wonderful grace and mercy. All right, so that is an introduction to the book of Ruth. We'll have the verse by verse studies in a different section of this YouTube channel. Uh, if you feel like this has been helpful, you're welcome to share this link with other people who might benefit. Thank you for viewing, and good day.